Today we are going to be discussing Michel Foucault, probably the most significant theorist still operating in the intellectual world. He was born in 1926 in Poitiers, France, as Paul-Michel, carrying on a family tradition of having that first name, but he went by Michel. The family was of the countryside bourgeoisie, and his father was an authoritarian physician. For whatever reason, Michel had a troubled emotional life. He was a homosexual, and he did attempt suicide several times. We don't know how all these pieces fit together very specifically because he avoided giving many details of his life. He tried to lose himself in his work, and in his work he disavowed any notion of authorial continuity. In fact, he said, the main interest in life and work is to become someone else that you were not in the beginning. It's a very beautiful ideal, but still the question is, and it raises the question for us, in our own living of a life, do we want to have a story that could be told that is intelligible, or do we want a life that is so full of ruptures that it wouldn't fit very easily into a narrative? We probably want something in between, right? We don't want a conventional narrative, but we also want something that would make sense as a life to live. But he wants this radical sense of discontinuity because, and this is the question I would like to put forward in this introduction to his thought, can we live emancipated lives within the systems of modern power? I think that is a good way of getting at what Foucault puts before us, even though his works are varied and they do represent changes in position over time. But his emancipatory interest is always there, and his concern is always with the discourses and disciplines of modern power. So I do think that his position at the top of theory, with a capital T, over the last few decades, is well earned because he is essential as providing, as he says, a toolbox for overcoming marginalization. A way of looking at the massive forces that have been arrayed against the human individual in the modern world, the vast array of powers that have been made available to us. But as Foucault is pointing out, it's not always without great cost. That is, there's a modern normativity which also normalizes the human person, that makes us have to fit into a definite set of discourses and expectations. He himself wanted to explore limit experiences. He wanted to, which were transgressive. He wanted to go beyond the bourgeois, the normal. He needed more than little everyday pleasures. He needed intensity. Now, there's probably psychological reasons for that. But for whatever reason, he did live a life that accorded with this desire for intensity, and he did die of AIDS in 1984. This is one of those great tragedies. He discovered Nietzsche in the 50s, and this was decisive for his life. He is, in fact, a Nietzschean. So we've talked about Nietzsche in the past. This reemergence of the Nietzschean impulse in Foucault is essential to his appeal. Because in a world where the sacred no longer exists for most modern human beings, the notion of a dynamic system that's somehow progressing has to be tempered by a recognition that that system is also a cage. And so if Nietzsche valued the vitality of life as it emerges in different forms, and he always wanted to get the healthy as opposed to the sick, for Foucault, he's looking at how power is coursing through this closed system and he wants to find sites of disruption. He wants to find ways of being able to stand apart from the possibilities that have been regimented for us. So he does want to open up new possibilities within a closed system, and that really is a Nietzschean way of looking at things. Foucault received his degrees in philosophy and psychology from the Sorbonne in 1961. He had very famous teachers, the phenomenologist Merleau-Ponty, the structural Marxist Althusser, the existentialist Jean Hippolyte, under whom he studied for a very long time. He had a best-selling book, a difficult text, words and things, translated as The Order of Things in English in 1966. It's a difference about France's public realm and America's that a book of this kind could be on the bestseller list. But it did seem to mark the passing of the torch from the preeminence of Jean-Paul Sartre, who dominated the French intellectual scene for decades, and his existentialism. It seemed to be passing to Foucault, and at the time, a kind of structuralist commitment. So structuralism is the sense that more basic than our sense of individual initiative is a system of structural forces, above all language, that makes possible even our thinking. It gives us the range within which we can operate. But being the protean that he was, Foucault did not stay in the structuralist camp for long. He, in fact, is known now as one of the most prominent post-structuralists, or the most prominent post-structuralist. So that again gives you a sense of how movable this man's critique was. And that reminds us of Nietzsche also, that Nietzsche is a mobile critic, and that's the way that Foucault is. You can't pin him down. He's very good they're both good at tearing things down. They're not good at presenting a positive system. And there's good reasons for that, but that's also difficult. If you want to emancipate oppressed peoples, it's hard not then to be committed to very specific positions. I do think there's a lot to be said, though, for Foucault's ability to stand back from partisan entanglements. He did join the Communist Party briefly when he was younger, but then turned pretty strongly against that party. He did get involved after the general strikes of 1968, which was a very important moment in the cultural history of France. The 68ers, the 68ers, where that still marks the intellectual scene. I think it's important for us to recognize that, though it's hard to gauge the ramifications of what was meant to be a play for social revolution, we know this in America because at the same time we had our own upheavals. We tend to talk about them only in terms of the sexual revolution, but I think we need to think about the comparison to 1848 and those revolutions, and in comparison, 68 looks pretty feckless to me. That is, the system of modern power that Foucault was analyzing, that oligarchic control, that's so firmly in place. All of these social diversions, it seems to me, they don't seem to touch the basic cage that Foucault was analyzing. But after 68, he was more politically involved again. In fact, he was part, and this is very important for our own time, of this group d'information sur la prison. So he was part of a group that really wanted to make clear the inhumane conditions in French prisons. And we have that same question now in the era of mass incarceration in America. We need to have that kind of commitment. Eventually he ended up, so this is a brilliant academic career. He ends up in 1969 being named to the chair of the history of systems of thought at the Collège de France. This is the pinnacle of French academic life. He reached that, and that's the position he held to the end. This is a man very different from Nietzsche in being, though always an outsider, he still was, the consummate insider in the end as far as academic life goes, and that's something we need to keep in mind, because it's a dangerous thing always to try to do from an academic position the things that he wants to do, because politics is a very messy business. But I do think politics requires the kinds of critical perspectives that he was introducing to be done well. That academic distance, I do think, is, and that kind of discipline of thought of being not a partisan, I think is very important. That is, there's a lot to be said for his protean ethos as an academic, as an intellectual, compared to, say, Sartre, who fought in the resistance and who was he was the engaged intellectual, right? But the problem with French intellectual life under that Sartrean kind of animus was that if you didn't have specific positions in the party debates of the time, that is, if you weren't a leftist in particular, you were considered outré, out of bounds. And that's not a very good atmosphere for the intellectual to do his work. So I do think Foucault has a lot to be said for him in terms of rejecting polemics and wanting to go deeper to talk about problematizations instead of always staking out a clear point where his academic position has something to do with the real world politics. That it's good to keep a distance between those things. So it's a sword that cuts both ways. He did say that man was invented in the 16th century. So what we've studied in the last couple of cycles in the Great Conversation, it's this world that is Foucault's concern, that the rise of the modern state has done so much to construct a certain kind of subjectivity. And the work that he was engaged in at the end, The History of Sexuality, he's trying to say that even sexuality is a means, and this is where he's really revising what this was on Luitard we're going for, or the Marcusian-inspired American sexual revolutionaries. He's saying sexuality is also a tool of disciplining the modern subject, of making us docile for the regimes of power that are in place. And I think there's no question that he's right. So we get right and left, we get very worked up talking about sexuality, but in fact, the real business of power is happening behind the scenes, is the puppet master. So I think that kind of clarity of critique is necessary, absolutely essential. So he did describe himself as, if he was going to have a description, he was a critic. That's what he thought of himself as a philosopher. A critic in the line of Kant. And I think that he has vindicated the necessity of this intellectual humility of being able to say, I am not a guru. I don't have a grand scheme to present all of you. What I have is a toolbox that I offer for the possibility of creating new ways of existing in a world where those possibilities seem to be very constrained by very powerful interests. And that's why I do think, no matter the difficulties in his own life and the difficulties of trying to make sense of this whole scheme, this author function that we call Michel Foucault, we do need to pay attention to him, because the difficulties that biotechnology raise, for instance, the discipline that we impose on certain minorities, especially in terms of our penal policy, there are real and increasing dangers to the human personality that I do think Michel Foucault is absolutely essential in helping to address.